you said it's flushed out a bunch of bugs in Lightning, but it's also, is it fair to say, exposed some challenges, weaknesses in Lightning?
Yes and no. I mean, certainly it's always been the case. Like, when you're sending 1 millisatoshi in Lightning, obviously that's not enforceable. Like, it's under a Satoshi that could never appear on chain. Similarly, if you're sending 10 Satoshis in Lightning, it's also equivalently not enforceable. Like, we mentioned the dust limit. You can't send less than 500 and something Bitcoin Satoshis, 500 and something Satoshis without getting a miner to kind of directly incorporate your transaction. And so, we can't enforce those in Lightning either. If you're sending under some threshold, then it's not enforceable on chain, but it'll still be reflected in your total balance. So, it is the case that with Lightning, as fees goes up, that number also goes up, right? If it takes $10 to go to chain, are you really should you really go to the chain for $9 in HTLCs that are expiring or something? You probably shouldn't. And so now those like $9 payments become kind of pseudo unenforceable, right? They're not something you're going to go to chain over. If your counterparty misbehaves, you might lose. If you had, $9 in flight in pending transactions, you might lose them. But once they've completed, you won't lose them. That's a completed transaction. And so, there was this weird thing. Like, some people were like, oh yeah, like, every Lightning transaction is completely enforceable from like the moment it sends to the moment you get the pre-image. And that's not really true. It's more like once it fully completes, but like that happens too. So it doesn't really matter.
Can we back up a sec? Sorry, just so I'm clear. We're talking a difference between custodial and non-custodial Lightning, right?
No, even for non-custodial, right? Like, there's...
So in custodial, I can send 1 sat.
Right. In custodial, you can send 1 sat. Even in non-custodial Lightning, you can send 1,000th of a sat. But it doesn't... certainly when you close the channel eventually and you go to chain, that 1,000th of a sat is just going to disappear. But if you send 1,000 of those 1,000ths of a sat, then you'll actually get that sat on chain at the end of the day. And that will change your balance. And so, similarly for, again, when we're talking about dust, like if that payment is still pending and you close the channel while it's pending, you might lose it. But if that payment completes, it's a completed payment. So
what you're saying is if there's a channel open and I've only done 1 transaction that's $9, and when I close the channel, fees are $10, I don't get that.
You've wasted that.
Yeah.
And on top of that, if it was still pending, so like if you're even worse, right? If I send a $10 payment on Lightning and fees are 11 or whatever, and that $10 payment's still pending when I close the channel, which has been a problem due to some issues in Lightning implementation, due to some bugs over the last week, then not only do you pay that $10 in fee or $11 in fee, but you also lose that $10 payment. So you lose both, and so that's a concern. But in general, you just limit the amount that you have pending at any one time, and then you don't care, right? Like you have some risk threshold, and you say like, I'm willing to have $50 pending at one time, and then once those clear, I can send another $50, and that's not a problem. It's just like if we close while this thing is pending, I might lose it, and so that's always been a risk control that Lightning nodes have had. That's been in the protocol since day one. It's just becoming more relevant now, and so it's been like it's an issue some of our users had actually on LEK is like we had that risk threshold turned all the way down, and it was like the default was very low. And so we had some people show up like, I can't send payments at all. And we're like, yeah, you're exceeding your risk threshold. You should turn up your risk threshold. So we had to change the defaults there. But yeah, I mean, like it has exposed this, like Lightning is not perfect, and it has these risk thresholds in it, and it has some risk associated with payments that are not yet completed. And people kind of had swept that under the rug or ignored it. And it's like, no, it's there, and it's really there, and you have to be aware of it. But I don't think it's like you asked like, did it expose shortcomings in Lightning? And I don't think that's kind of a shortcoming because, again, once that payment completes, it's completed, right? Even if you sent, one sat, like once it completes, it's completed. And if you close the channel now, you will have one sat more than you would have otherwise. And so I think like it's known, it's a risk, but it doesn't affect the eventual outcome and the normal outcome.
Yeah. But so let's look at a scenario where we get into a permanent high fee environment. We had Michael Saylor in here a few days ago, and he put a wild kind of idea out there, but he said, look, people are used to, if you buy a multi-million-dollar painting, you're used to paying a commission, which is 10%. And, if you buy a house, a $20 million house, there might come a day where someone's buying, $20 million of Bitcoin, and they might be paying, I think he's wrong, but anyway, hundreds of thousands in fees. I think the main point in that is if we get into a permanently high fee environment, imagine an on-chain fee was £1,000 or $1,000, even $100. And that's kind of the average, and you kind of get away from that. Have we created an environment where there's certainly an environment where some people just can't afford to use the base chain? That's fine. Mm-hmm. But can we get people onto Lightning without them having to use the base chain?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the like non-custodial, mobile, small value Lightning becomes a concern. And I do and a lot of those people get priced out. I think there are. It's kind of the best we can do now, right? Yeah. So like we want to. I always view the like custodial, non-custodial question as like custodial will always win. Custodial is always going to be a better user experience. It's always going to be just easier to use for everyone. There's costs associated with it regulatorily, but aside from the regulatory costs, it's just going to be better. So my job as a software engineer and our job as kind of the Bitcoin community and the Bitcoin engineering community is to improve non-custodial as much as we can to get it as close as we can to the custodial user experience. We'll never beat it, but we can get as close as we can. And maybe with the regulatory costs, we can actually beat it. That is an iterative process, right? Historically, the like non-custodial experience has just been on chain. It's been like a 10-minute transaction time. It's been basically unusable. Like 10 minutes for a transaction to even show up and it's still pending is like unusable garbage user experience, right? With Lightning, we've improved it a lot, and we've improved both the scalability of it and the instant transaction times, which is great, huge win. But there are still steps to go for scalability, right? So there's whether you do channel factories, there's potentially other designs around covenants and payment pools. So there's a lot in the future that we need to add to make Lightning and Lightning-like systems better. And I think there's a lot of gray area between custodial and non-custodial that's largely unexplored.
Can you ever be non-custodial in Lightning without having a base chain transaction, or you always?
I think that's where this gray area comes in. So I think there's a lot of gray area between custodial and non-custodial.
Yeah,
where you have, there's some of it that's been explored. There's kind of like the liquid model where it's just like a multi-sig, and now there's like these eCash mints, the like Cashew and Fedimint that are also kind of multi-sig. So there's kind of this multi-sig model that's exciting. But then I think there's other models. There's like payment pools and Lightning channel factories where you kind of have like maybe you get together with 4 people and you collaboratively own a UTXO. And then like with channel factories, you can be like, all right, we're going to have the 4 of us own this UTXO. And then we can like dynamically create and reshuffle the liquidity between the channels that we all create within this UTXO without ever creating on-chain transactions. And I think there's similar models where we can also take another step towards custodial, where we can say like, okay, we're going to do something like that. But currently the problem with those designs is like everyone who owns that UTXO collaboratively has to be online at the same time to update it. That's obviously a concern. So like, can we do better? Can we say like, all right, we're going to have a kind of sort of custodial entity that manages the UTXO, but then at any point, any one individual who like has ownership rights to it can go to chain and unilaterally withdraw their funds from their shared UTXO, and they can like go off and leave, or maybe they're being censored, or maybe the if that centralized entity misbehaved, then people could leave and take money from them or whatever. They could be punished, like in Lightning, right? Where like if you misbehave, you broadcast an old state, you lose your money. And so I think there's a lot of models like that have yet to be explored, and certainly yet to be implemented. There's, people have some ideas for how to do some of these. There's new ideas coming out for how to do other ones, let alone getting to implementation, which is years down the road. But I don't think it's fair to say that like Lightning today, yeah, if you're talking about $100 transaction fee and you're someone who maybe only has, $500, you're not going to have an on-chain Lightning UTXO. But I don't think that means that you can't use Lightning and Lightning-like systems. We just have to build different ways to get people into those systems. And like multi-party UTXO ownership is going to be figured out. It's complicated, and it's going to be really complicated to implement. But I think there are directions that we'll get to by the time we need it.
Yeah. I mean, I almost think if I open up a Lightning channel, I kind of want it almost semi-permanently open.
Yeah.
That's my Lightning wallet now. What reason do I want to close it?
Right. And I think that's how it will certainly be. I mean, I mentioned like in the last week or two, we've seen a lot of bugs show up in Lightning implementations that have caused forced closure that maybe shouldn't have.
Okay.
And those are things we need to fix. Those are things that certainly the LDK team has been working on, improving some defaults, changing policy so that we're less aggressive about force close. And then there's some bugs in other implementations that we're like working around. We have like workarounds to like if the other implementation gets stuck, making sure that we can like unstick the protocol, and trying to help other implementations debug their issues as well. So that's an area that needs improvement and is being improved upon. But yeah, I mean, aside from just bugs, like I agree with you. Like you generally, especially if you're a consumer and you just have a Lightning channel, you're never gonna move that around. It's really only people who are like redoing their channels to move around where the liquidity is in the network.
So we're really just talking about layers of trust models.
Yeah, we really, Bitcoin needs to evolve into a mini shades of gray, right?
Yeah.
It's historically been white or black, and we're slowly starting to fill in some of the grays, but we need way more shades.
What do you think of things like, what do you think of Fedimint?
I mean, yeah, I think these kinds of models are really cool. This kind of like multi-sig model, again, we need shades of gray, and it's a really cool shade. The only question for all of these, I think once you get into the shades of gray, the question very quickly becomes, what are the regulatory burdens and how expensive is it to comply with whichever rules we need to comply with? And often, how expensive is it to figure out what rules we need to comply with? Yeah. Like how much do we have to pay the lawyers to tell us which rules we need to pay attention to and what we can get away with? And so I think especially for the multi-sig models that comes into play, where you're talking about, eCash schemes, like, what is, I think like the Fedimint folks have always kind of argued more like community banks, right? Where it's like everyone knows each other. And so, you don't necessarily have a heavy regulatory burden because you actually know your users, and you could argue certain things which might or might not hold legal water. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. But they'd also be awesome if we could like really scale them, but probably for regulatory reasons you can't. And so we'll really see where it goes.
That's why I quite like what Callie's doing, because he's basically ignoring the regulatory thing. He's just created a protocol that works now. You can use it, and he's
right. I mean, yeah, that's obviously the first step, but Bitcoin has a long history of engineers building stuff and then users ignoring it.
True.
So there does need to be something that leads to people really using it. And it'll be interesting to see how adoption looks for that kind of thing. And I mean, like we've seen it with like Liquid and Rootstock, and like Liquid has no users.
Yeah.
Like they invested how much money into building this thing. It's a cool multi-sig model. It has better privacy properties, but nobody really wants to use it. So
Yeah, so I think in a high fee environment, something like Liquid might make a comeback.
maybe people are quicker to move to Litecoin. Like people just, you know, if you're really doing a normal end user transaction, you're just going to move to something else that's like,
But I think
some shitcoin that
I think that's in an environment where we've got temporary high fees. I'm thinking more permanent high fees. You know, if you could I don't know, park a Bitcoin within Liquid, and you could send Liquid Bitcoin around to people. I see that could be a helpful scenario.
I think, you know, I mean, we've seen this across the cryptocurrency space how many times where like one chain will start with low fees. They'll like, you know, their whole reason for being is like, the fees on Bitcoin are too high. We've created this chain. It's going to scale better. We're going to have low fees. And then either it goes nowhere or fees on Bitcoin go up. People start using it and suddenly it has high fees too. And then people move on to the next thing. Right. And so you really have to look at like what are people trying to accomplish for having this Bitcoin, right? Are they trying to have this Bitcoin to actually spend? Are they trying to do economic activity? They're just going to dump it and go use Litecoin or whatever. And they'll just, they'll hold Bitcoin on Binance. And then when they want to transact, they'll buy some Litecoin and they'll go use it. Or they'll buy some Monero and they'll go, whatever it is. Versus, is someone like trying to trade Bitcoin? They're trying to or maybe they're trying to invest in Bitcoin. They're worried about the Fed, whatever. They've bought a bunch of Bitcoin. They have a stack. And then maybe they transact occasionally. Again, they might just have it in a custodial service. They might, the part that they want to transact, they'll keep it in a custodial service. They'll use Litecoin, they'll use whatever. And then just like that investment, they don't care what the fee is. $100 fee on their $1 million investment's not a huge deal. And so I think in practice, we haven't really seen that outcome where people are like, oh yeah, I want to switch to Liquid, or I want to switch to using Lightning. In general, people just kind of Bitrefill had a long Twitter thread. Matt Alberg, their I think head of data, had a long Twitter thread basically doing some analysis on this, and basically concluded during high fee spikes, they're just their data, which is more kind of consumer wanting to use cryptocurrency for transactions, less invest in cryptocurrency kind of users. Really doesn't show an uptick in Lightning during high fee environments. It shows an uptick in Litecoin. Also because people have their money on Binance. Binance doesn't support Lightning. When Binance supports Lightning, that might make a big difference.
Well, so firstly, we need the exchanges to be supporting Lightning. I mean, That's a really important thing. And it's surprising more haven't. I've been impressed with what Kraken have done there. I think it's very cool. But you present an interesting use case there for Litecoin in that there's maximalists who think everything that isn't Bitcoin is a shitcoin. But if Litecoin is, it's basically the same protocol as Bitcoin, basically.
It's similar. And I mean, these people aren't investing in Litecoin. They're buying Litecoin and then dumping it on the other side because it has as much liquidity as Bitcoin. Well,
what I'm thinking is it's a pressure valve for Bitcoin. And is that such a bad thing?
Kind of. These things have acted that way in the past. I don't think it's a bad thing. I certainly assign no moral judgment to that. What do I care what people use? People are going to use the system that works best for them. I hope we can make Bitcoin that system, and Lightning is a part of that.
Of course. But while we wait.
But while we wait, these things exist and people will use them, and that's how it is. And if you want to, if you're a what's Jameson Lopp call them now, Bitcoin Puritans. We're trying to, every time you say something negative about Bitcoin maxis, a bunch of people show up and are like, I like Bitcoin and why are you shitting on me? It's like, yeah,
Scammer.
You weren't who I was referring to. I was referring to the people who are Puritans about it and scream that everything's a shitcoin, not you person who just likes Bitcoin. So every time you say Bitcoin maxis, people show up and get offended. So we're calling them Bitcoin Puritans now.
Okay, so the ideological ones who won't see reason with anything.
Right.
What was that wallet? The guy we met in New York where it's got Bitcoin, Litecoin, Monero. Cake. Yeah. So there's an interesting argument for a wallet like Cake where you got your Bitcoin balance, you got your Monero balance, you got your Litecoin. Fees are high on Bitcoin, but if you can just switch some of that, auto trade that into Litecoin, send your transaction or receive it and auto switch it back. And, if you want to do a private transaction, you can switch it into Monero and do it. There is an argument for that. I mean,
the coolest thing about that wallet is that you can buy gift cards with Monero with no KYC.
Very cool.
So you can actually buy like real life things with no KYC.
Yeah,
that's nice.
And it's a cool wallet. I've seen it, I've used it, and they sponsored the show for a bit. But I can, I'm tired of the ideological fights. It's after 6-7 years, it's like, oh, please,
just annoying. Yeah,
yeah, and I come down to use case. If someone wants to use it, it has a use case.
Yeah, and I really hope we can build out Bitcoin to be that compelling for everything.
But in the meantime,
they exist and they're going to get used and whatever.
And Litecoin is never going to be number one. It's never going to overtake Bitcoin. There's no threat in that scenario. But I've always had a soft spot for Litecoin anyway. I mean, I like Charlie Lee a lot. I think he's a great dude.
Yeah. I mean, I assign no moral judgment to people using whatever system they want to use that works for them. I think if you're a Bitcoin Puritan and you get mad that people are using Litecoin, fix Bitcoin.
Yeah,
that's on you.
Yeah.
Like you don't get to be mad about people using Ethereum or Litecoin or whatever. Go improve Bitcoin. Go spend your time and energy doing something other than tweeting.